Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group. 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's BEAT-IRS. Serving Alaskans, Americans since 1978. Defending us, as they put it, against the modern-day Gestapo. We have with us KrisAnne Hall. She's a constitutional law attorney. She has quite a history, was a prosecutor, lost her job for being an activist. She's also a disabled veteran, linguist. I've met her a number of times before. Probably going to see her again here sometime soon because she's an activist, and we show up at some of the same events. KrisAnne, I was brought to your attention again by YouTube that now has gone viral. Last time I looked, it had several 100,000 hits, maybe over 1 million now. But you basically put out a videotape defense of what's going on in Oregon. I promised my listeners last week that they'd hear from you. I thought that it was a pretty articulate defense. One of the things I want to first get into before we go directly to the legal and perhaps other justifications for what you see, at least, as to what's happened there, let's talk a little bit about kind of the origins of this. My understanding is you had some involvement. I mentioned last week that we had received back from somebody that had talked to the head of the Oath Keepers the suggestion that this was not, in fact, the real deal. What's your take on it? What was your involvement from the outset?
Well, you know, I am a member of a group called COWS. It's the Coalition of Western States, and we're a group of over 50 legislators from the Western states, attorneys, and grassroots activists. And we were brought into this very, very early on before anything happened. And as a matter of fact, Ammon Bundy reached out to me for some direction in what he wanted to do. And so I can assure you that this is no false flag, that this is something that Ammon Bundy feels very strongly about, and something that he was determined to bring to light to the people. He believed that the situation with the Hammonds was a bit like a battered woman syndrome. And the analogy that he gave to me in our conversation was, if you're walking out of a store and you go through a parking lot and you see a man just beating the tar out of his wife, he says, do you walk by and leave the situation alone simply because the woman is not crying out for help? And that's what he feels in his heart about the Hammond situation. The Hammonds, over the last years, have been literally, federally and legally beaten into submission. And they've been scared, like a battered spouse, to even cry out for help. And Ammon said, we can't let this happen. He's a strong Christian man, and he believed that it's not a matter of loving my neighbor to watch him get beaten in front of me. And so this is no false flag. So I there's a lot of things that Mr. Bundy and I discussed that I'm not at liberty to, say publicly, but I can tell you that he has the most honest and sincere intentions in this. And it's very good because the people, I just spoke to some people in the community today, and the community is really starting to step up and get educated about this.
So, yeah, I saw what looked like to be almost a town hall setting where people were commenting on what happened and what was going on. And most were actually, frankly, supportive, at least of the event that I saw. Now, just some of our listeners might not even be familiar with the Bundys. Ammon, I don't want to go too far off course on this, but Ammon, how's he connected to all of this?
Well, Ammon Bundy is the one who really started this protest. He's the one that became very good friends with the Hammonds. And the Hammonds are very quiet and reserved people. They're sort of very restrictive as to who they let in their circle because they've been so battered and beaten by the federal government over the last few decades. And so they let after what happened at the Bundy Ranch, they let the Bundys into their fold, and they became friends. And so Ammon Bundy is the son of Clevin Bundy. And Ammon, after going through what they went through, really felt compelled in his heart to take a stand in defense of the Hammonds.
So what went down in Oregon is not exactly like what you would have wanted to see. What kind of, if you're at freedom or liberty to talk about this, What happened that you aren't in full agreement with there?
It's not something that I am able to talk about. A lot of things were given to me in confidence, and even though I'm not a practicing attorney at the moment, I do respect that sort of relationship that I have with people that have confided within me. All I have to say about that really is that we've got to understand what's going on here in Oregon, because the situation and this is what Ammon Bundy really wanted to bring to light, and this is the part that I did agree with, is that this is not about the Hammonds, this is not about the Bundys, this is about the federal government who has leaped out, crawled, scratched, clawed, and fought its way out of its limited and defined box. It's about exposing the fact that the federal government is using an authority it does not have to oppress the farmers and the ranchers, stealing their land, stealing their resources, and being worse than the schoolyard bully about it. The fact that the Hammonds were prosecuted for burning lands and then charged with not simply with just burning the lands, but trying to cover up a poaching incident, and then sentenced to 5 years in prison for no proof of actual poaching, just the only allegation that they burned the lands to cover it up, is so in violation of the Eighth Amendment, just simply on its face, of cruel and unusual punishments. And then the lack of total due process in this whole situation. Sure, they had a jury of their peers, but there's also evidence of jury tampering and the fact, number one, that the federal government doesn't have any constitutional authority whatsoever, Joe, to own land.
That's right.
There is absolutely no authority within the Constitution for the federal government to own land outside Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, and that's simply 10 miles square for Washington, D.C., and the land necessary to maintain forts and ports only at the permission of the states.
And likely embassies as well. But, I mean, the fact of it is that the federal government has gone ramshot over this whole thing. I mean, everybody just assumes it as a matter of course that the federal government's in proper title of these lands. What I think has been so helpful about what happened in Oregon is that now it's been brought to the radar screen of most Americans yet again. The Nevada incident with Cliven Bundy, of course, helped. This is another. Now, the question, of course, that has been raised is, has Ammon Bundy achieved what he's needed to achieve? In other words, it's on the radar screen of folks. It's discussed again. Is there really any benefit for them to stay in place, in fact, risk, what could be a very bad outcome? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that it's just one of those things that only time will tell. I can tell you that on the ground there are a lot of things happening. Because of what has happened, there are educators coming in. I know the Center for Self-Governance is coming in, and there are other people that are coming in to teach on these issues. And just, between you and me, I may be one of those people that may be going out to Oregon to teach. So we're praying about that and seeing how that happens. And but once again, the only thing that we're really going to that's really going to change all of this is the proper education of the people, because you're right, because most people operate with the standard baseline that, well, the federal government's supposed to be there. After all, they're federal lands. And you watch the media talk about the fact that the federal Bundys are occupying a federal building on federal lands, and national parks are the standard. And that sort of encompasses both parties, because after all, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and Teddy Roosevelt's establishment of national parks was completely and totally unconstitutional. Not even recognizing the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was the leader of the progressives of 1912 and is the reason we have the 17th Amendment and the destruction of the sovereignty of the states. But what we need to understand here is that, as Samuel Adams said, that when a people become universally ignorant, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. And I know that's what's happened in America. We've been trained on the wrong things on the Constitution and the wrong parameters of government power for so long that we simply take things for granted that just are not true. And now we have the opportunity to come in and teach the truth.
We absolutely appreciate your efforts in that regard. I'd like to keep you on for another segment to talk a little bit more about the details of what's going on in Oregon. Stay with us. The Joe Miller Show. We'll be right back with constitutional law attorney KrisAnne Hall after these messages. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We're here on air with KrisAnne Hall, constitutional law attorney. She's out there fighting the good fight, telling people about what the Constitution means, its original intent. I'm going to pop an interesting question on her toward the end of this interview. And KrisAnne, I apologize, I didn't talk to you about it during the break. This is not a surprise attack, but we put up an interesting article on joemiller.us today that is somewhat controversial. We'll get to that in a minute. That's the tease to keep everybody listening to the Joe Miller Show. But KrisAnne, a quick question about the video that you put out that has really taken YouTube by storm. Hundreds of thousands of hits. Your YouTube channel itself has exploded. There was a number of comments that I've read following it that that you're just being very revolutionary in your approach, that you're almost calling for, maybe even armed resistance against the federal government. Was that your intent, or do you think people are just trying to make something out of nothing?
Well, I think that here's the situation that we're in, Joe. We have an issue where we've become so politically correct that for some reason the advocating for the exercise of our rights seems radical. Right? So I am not calling for armed revolution. I am calling for the people to exercise their rights. I am calling for people to take back the sovereignty of the states. That does not require an armed revolution. And perhaps that seems radical to people who do not understand the Constitution, who are not educated on their rights. We have a Supreme Court justice, I'm from Florida, we have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll and asked this question, and he said, name all 5 liberties in your First Amendment. And he found out in this poll in Florida that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment. And so when you start calling for people to exercise their rights, it seems radical because people don't even know what their rights are. And I would just simply say the people who are saying that know nothing about me, and that all their only exposure to me is just simply that video, because I never said anything like that. And if they were to go to my website, KrisAnneHall.com, or watch more videos that I have, or go to my Facebook page, they would see that all I am doing is echoing the words of our framers and teaching the fundamental principles of our Constitution.
What do you think about the fact, though, that the folk that have taken over this, what is purportedly under federal title, but we know there's not constitutional authority for it, the fact that they have guns, that they're armed, do you think that's a right move, that they should have gone in there armed, that they continue to maintain an armed defense to that location?
Well, then again, I would probably be viewed as radical in this sense, because I agree with our framers in that guns are not radical, and the carrying of arms is not radical. Richard Henry Lee, one of our founders and the drafter of the congressional act that created our state, said, whereas to preserve liberty, it's essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms. And it was in the minds of our framers that there would never be a moment we would not be carrying our sidearms. And that was the whole purpose of the Second Amendment, was to remind us that we have an inherent right to do this. And the fact that we've been sort of brainwashed into thinking that guns are controversial and guns are violent and guns kill people is what brings this perspective that carrying guns is radical. But carrying guns is an essential expression of your right. And again, it only seems radical to people who do not understand their rights. And I've said this before, if you believe that freedom of speech is radical, if you believe that Second Amendment, that the right to keep and bear arms is radical, then we must remember that expressing our rights is only radical to 2 classes of people, tyrants and slaves. And maybe this is a good opportunity for us to sit back and classify ourselves.
This is one kind of positive aspect of this country at this point. I think, and maybe polling will say that I'm wrong on this, but my sense of, and this is again looking kind of at the inputs that we have through social media, radio input, things of that nature, it seems as if people are getting more, shall we say, familiar with the Second Amendment rights that they have. The pushback against, for example, Obama's town hall reflected again, kind of the people of the country are getting that concept. The pushback against the Virginia AG that recently destroyed reciprocity with 20-plus other states. Is it your sense that people are starting to get the concept of the Second Amendment, the fact that it is designed to counter the tyrants, that the fundamental right was established to ensure that we can maintain personal and individual liberties against a tyrant? Or do you think that's an area that there really is a need for increased education because we're losing the battle?
Well, I would say yes and yes. I think it's a great thing. And as Thomas Paine wrote in his series of essays called The Crises, that crises always have a good effect. And the good effect of this crisis is that people are becoming more informed. I listened to a local radio show the other day, and I heard a caller call in and simply and practically reiterate the crux of my lessons on the right to keep and bear arms and their fundamental foundations. And I think 10 years ago, that would not have been something that would have just simply rolled off the tongue of the general public. And I think that's a great thing that we're getting educated. Do we need more education? Absolutely. I played on my radio show today a clip from Eric Holder from 1995 in which Eric Holder claims that it was the job and the duty of the government to brainwash the people into thinking differently about guns.
Right,
and
I
so
remember that.
So we've got a lot of ground to cover. And the first thing that we can do, what you're doing, Joe, what we're doing is trying to change the narrative. We need to change this away from gun rights. These are not Second Amendment rights. These are inalienable rights. Samuel Adams wrote in 1772 that the natural rights were life, liberty, property, and the right to protect them. If you have to ask permission for the right to protect your life, your liberty, and your property, you are a slave. You are not a free man. And so it is an inherent right. Samuel Adams pointed out that our right to protect ourselves is a part of the first law of nature, which is the law of self-preservation. And so we don't need government's permission to protect ourselves. It's a matter of natural law. It's inherent in our creation.
I absolutely agree with you. Very well said. I want to turn to that last question that is somewhat controversial. I don't know whether you saw the LA Times editorial yesterday. Of course, you've heard Trump's comments on the issue about the differences between natural-born and U.S. citizens. It's very controversial because there are currently two different individuals running for president today that some have raised questions about. We put up an article on restoringliberty.com this morning that doesn't mention any presidential candidate, but just goes through the basic requirements for the presidents from an originalist perspective. Mm-hmm. What is your take on the question? Do you think that this is kind of a red herring, something that's a distraction, or do you think it's an important issue that people ought to get to the bottom of?
Well, I think it really is an important issue, but I don't think we're asking the right questions. And there's an article on my website called Understanding Citizenship. And I think the real question should always be this: why? Why did our framers make natural-born citizen a requirement for the President of the United States? And in that article, I outline the framers' perspective on why it was necessary to make sure that someone was natural-born. I believe that our framers relied on the writings of Vattel and others to determine that a natural-born citizen was one of two parents who were citizens at the time of birth. And I think from an originalist perspective, you can't dispute that. The reason that I wrote the article about understanding citizenship is because we do have two different camps now. We have a group that believes, as our framers believe, from an originalist perspective, and then we have a group who believe from the modern law perspective, which has sort of changed the originalist perspective on natural-born citizen. And I think the real question is, before you choose which camp you want to be in, we need to understand why. Because our framers didn't do anything on a whim. They lived with, and I teach, there's 700 years of history that created the Constitution. And so our framers didn't sort of make up anything. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in our Declaration, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights that's original. It's all taken from 5 documents of British law that were written over 700 years. And so they used 700 years of experience to know why the president had to be a natural-born citizen. Their king and queen had to take an oath, and George Washington wrote in his farewell address that foreign influence was the greatest foe to Republican government.
Got to wrap it up, KrisAnne Hall. I appreciate your insights, articulate as always. Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. We'll be right back.